This episode is sponsored by Monkey Stuff. Monkey Stuff makes things for makers. We're inspired every day by the craft and creativity of makers and design and manufacture tools and accessories to try to make your making life a bit more delightful. Our products are designed in California, by makers and for makers, and manufactured in the USA. Check out our line of pottery accessories and tools at monkeystuff.com. Follow us on Instagram to see what we're up to in our studios, and keep on making great things.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply located in Dayton, Ohio, exclusive distributor of Jen Allen templates and Put a Lid on It t-shirts. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs, including the largest stock of GR pottery forms at cornellstudiosupply.com. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 568 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. I'd like to thank the folks that came out for the live taping that we did just a few weeks ago at the Workhouse Arts Center down in Lorton, Virginia. I'm going to have that episode in the near future for you up on the podcast feed, but we're actually going to take a little break from the Workhouse Arts series that I was doing, and today we're going to talk to artist and educator Eric Rempe. Eric has been teaching in high school ceramic programs for over 20 years, and in our interview we talk about building the infrastructure and curriculum for Coronado High School in California and the Princeton Day School in New Jersey. We also discuss his exploration of form, which has been influenced by colorblindness, and his role in co-founding the Princeton Pottery Festival. Along with 11 other artists, Eric will be presenting new work as a part of this year's festival happening this weekend, May the 2nd and 3rd. I'm happy to be exhibiting in the festival as well, and this year we have expanded the lineup to 12 artists, as well as demos from 4 of those artists that will be happening at 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock each day. And then we're also going to have a special keynote lecture from Chris Staley, which will be Saturday at 4:15. If you're interested in finding out more about the festival, you can go to PrincetonPotteryFestival.com. If you'd like to follow Eric, you can find him on Instagram or check out his website. That's RempePottery.com. Before we get to this interview, I also wanted to plug the Tales from the Vault podcast feed, which is where all of the super old episodes, some of the classics from this podcast, they now live over on that feed. That is an exclusive perk for supporters on Patreon, so if you'd like to gain access to dozens of episodes, you can go and make a pledge at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I thought we would start talking about the transition you made from graduate school at San Diego State into teaching at Coronado High School, because you had kind of a rare opportunity to literally build a high school program. So can you talk about designing a studio and what went into that?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of lead up to that. I was in grad school at San Diego State, and we were set to leave for Ecuador for 2 weeks. I think it was maybe 6 grad students going to study some pottery in the Amazon that was made by the Quichua. And so I was packing to leave on Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon to leave the next morning, and somebody let me know that they were looking to start one class of ceramics at Coronado High School. So I called down and talked to human resources, and he said, well, some time has passed since your friend learned about it, and they actually told you because we put it in the course registry, and 180 kids signed up to take ceramics. So we're no longer looking to start one class. We'd like to start a full program of ceramics. Are you still interested? And so I said, absolutely. He said, well, we're interviewing next week. So we'd love to have you come down. I said, well, I'm actually getting on a plane at 6 o'clock in the morning to leave for Ecuador for 2 weeks. So he asked if I could, at least get him something to look at. So in the midst of trying to plan to leave the country, I was suddenly scrambling to sort of write my teaching philosophy and update my resume and get photos and everything that the application required. So I got all that done and gave it to my roommate who dropped it off on Monday. And then I got an email in Quito, Ecuador, that they were, they were very interested in based on what they saw, and they wanted to interview me. So I actually interviewed for the position at Coronado from an internet cafe in 2000, and it was literally brand new technology there. So I was inside this little like telephone booth, and they would ask a question and there would be a lag, and it was crazy. So it was a great interview. And then they said, well, we're going to hold off on hiring until you get back. We want to interview you in person. So I landed Sunday, 2 weeks later. They interviewed me Monday, and Tuesday morning offered me the job. And then when I signed the contract, the vice principal grabbed me and said, can you come in my office now? And so we walked in there, and he said, now that you've signed the contract, I can tell you that we're tearing down this high school, building a brand new one. And part of your job is to design a state-of-the-art facility for ceramics. So it was pretty unbelievable, and also a pretty nice connection. Back in my program at San Diego State, I had gone to my professors and asked, you could sometimes design classes. So I said, I'd like to design a class that is basically doing all of the design research for a ceramic studio that I might need after I graduate. Everything from, plumbing and electrical to the layout of the facility and how clay arrives and how everything moves through a studio. So I had done that as a sort of proposed class with them, and then I get this opportunity to design a full program. And so it was just kind of taking a lot of the research that I'd already done and then scaling it up for a much larger program as opposed to a studio for one. But a lot of the ideas were sort of still the same, just kind of beefed up.
One of the things about the way you design this, both at San Diego State and Penn State, where you were in school, those were designed with multiple rooms. But with Coronado, it's like I don't know you can describe it better, but basically everything had to work in one room. Plus, I guess the kiln room is separate, but all the kids, which was hundreds of kids, needed to flow through one space.
Yeah, and so it was that building in particular was a remodel. So they were tearing it down to the steel and building it back up from the steel. So there were some limitations in the sense that the structural walls couldn't be moved. So I did have some parameters to work, inside of, and that one room was kind of one of them. We did have a supply room with clay making and all the raw materials for glaze mixing, and then a small glaze room. But in terms of the work area, it was one large room, which was, it is kind of nice as a teacher, especially in the high school, to be able to sort of have eyes on everybody at the same time, unless they were, taking work out to the kiln room.
So when you're designing a studio, I think about safety as one. With high school students, like you said, you need to be able to monitor them. But what else do you think is essential? Because you've now taught there, you've taught at Princeton Day School, you've taught workshops in a bunch of different places. So what do you think is core that a good studio needs to have?
Well, I'll answer. I think one of the things that's important is the decisions that I made are things that I felt like were the best. But I mean, I think you could probably interview 5 different people and you might get 5 different answers. But the flow of work through a studio, I think, is something that's really critical. And how does your raw material, truckload arrive? Where does it go? Where is it being used right after it comes in that door? Workflow from the students when they're, making work. Where does it go next? Where does it go in the kiln room? Where does it go after that shelf that's in the, basically just think about following the clay from when it arrives until it's sort of exiting as a glazed fired project in a kid's hands. And so thinking about that flow, I think, is really important. And then I've always tried to be very good about eliminating things that aren't really necessary. And I think as um, time passes, what I see a lot in studios is that they tend to get crowded with things, and people think, oh, I could use that table, I could use that chair, and over the course of years, stuff accumulates in that space, and I think that's often, they might have been free, but they might not necessarily have been essential for your studio. So having more open space, especially when you get into, like at Coronado, I had 30 kids in my class, and you have to have space for 30 kids to move through there. And if you start filling it up with stuff, which I think it just tends to happen. And so each year I try to really go through and edit, like, okay, I haven't used this in 5 years. Is it likely that I'm going to use it? Why did I get this in the first place? I shouldn't have gotten it. I need to, pass it on to somebody else who might be able to use it. So, keeping a clean studio safety wise, and also keeping it open to workflow and student flow. It just feels like a better space to be in when you do that, I think.
When I think about 30 students working in a class, like that's a lot. Like none of my college classes had 30 people. In fact, I'm trying to think of all the times I've taken academic courses, I don't think we've ever had more than 20. So when you have that many high school kids, like there's some practical space considerations, but there's also like you're dealing with high school kids they have a lot going on and they're figuring out themselves through the art making process. So how do you people manage classes of 30?
I mean, and it wasn't just 30 kids, it was 30 kids learning how to use the wheel for the first time. And, that's 30 wheels, 30 kids never having touched clay before. And so what I found out early on was, there were just so many kids that had their hand raised that had a question. And so I just started to pay attention to what the questions were. And so for example, with working at the wheel, one of the most common questions was like, what's the next step? I can't remember what the next step is. And so that kid has been sitting there while I've been answering other questions, waiting for the answer to what's the next step. So I started a tip sheet for throwing, and I just took those, it might have been a half dozen questions that I felt like these are the most common questions. And I put them on this tip sheet and I put it in front of every two wheels so that kids had this reference. And then what I saw was there were new questions that arose that became the new common six questions. And then I updated my tip sheet. Now it had 12 lines instead of 6. And so what that did was it eliminated me having to answer what were fairly simple questions just because the kid couldn't remember what the next step was or what the hand position was or how did you do this particular thing. So, and then over the years that sheet has just grown and grown and grown to basically a one full page, PDF that takes you from the very beginning when you sit down at the wheel, check the wheel direction and is your stool touching the wheel? So there's setup and then there's working. And so it just walks you through every single step. And then one day a kid said, Mr. Rempe, the tip sheet's great. Why don't you have a trimming tip sheet? I'm like, that's a great point. So then I made a trimming tip sheet. And so now that sign is front and back. So they flip it around based on whether or not they need to see the trimming or the throwing. And so while that was an insane number of students to teach on the wheel at the same time, it really just put me through the meat grinder and made me a much better teacher. So now I teach at Princeton Day School and I have 12 students in the class at the same time. And it's amazing. You can sit down with a student and have a discussion about the work that they're making and why they're making it and where they want to go, what's next. And you have the time to do that when you don't have all these kids just waiting with their hand up to ask questions. So, but I still have that same exact tip sheet in here, even though it's 12 students. And, again, that just frees me up that much more to have, I think, higher level intellectual and creative conversations.
I started as an art education major before I switched to studio. And there was one term that I will always remember from my education classes. And the teacher talked a lot about with high school students that you need to work within the zone of proximal development. So this is like a very ed term. But
Yep.
to simplify it, basically means if you don't push a student hard enough, they get bored and then you lose them and they're like paying attention, doing something else. But if you push them too hard, then they want to quit. So, like somewhere between boredom and wanting to quit is that zone of proximal development. Now, with a college kid, they might be able to tell you, or really, I guess, even high school kids can probably tell you where they're at in that. But I find that when you're learning something new, the hardest part is not wanting to quit. Like, I think there's this idea that that throwing should be a lot easier than it is. Like I run into this all the time with my students and it's just not easy. So how do you keep the students engaged and challenged, but also not so frustrated that they're like, this is not for me?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first few weeks of working, it's probably the most common feedback I give kids is that if you allow yourself to get frustrated, you're building a wall that you now have to, navigate around. You're making it more difficult for yourself. I tell them like, I'm not sitting here giving you a grade like, oh, so and so couldn't center today. Like, I'm looking at your work ethic and your attitude about how you embrace failure. So it's not going to go well for you when you sit down at the wheel and you try and center. It's going to be really, really challenging. You might have some fun, but you're going to be humbled by this pound and a half ball of clay in a way that you wouldn't think is possible. And so accept right now that you're not going to be throwing a beautiful vase today. It's just not going to happen. You have to learn how to center, and that's going to take time. And so for weeks, I'm just constantly reinforcing that. Just work hard and approach this with an attitude that you're sort of building this skill set, and you have to try and get the kids to stop thinking about a product and to think about a process and skill acquisition. And and then in that, you're sort of layering in positive reinforcement about the progress that they've made that they sometimes or many times don't really acknowledge or give themselves credit for. And so let's say you have a kid that's frustrated and, I sit down with them and I'm explaining something on the wheel. One of the things I'll always try and close with is like, how were you 2 weeks ago? Could you do this 2 weeks ago? And they're like, oh my God, no, like I was horrible 2 weeks ago. I couldn't. And so you're reminding them of all the progress they've made, even though they haven't been able to sort of throw that kind of big vase. And so I try to end on that. Like, you're so much better than what you were 2 weeks ago. And pivoting them away over and over from the idea of the product and more about the skill building, I think is one of the things that really helps. And then that, recognizing their little, not their little, but their successes.
Yeah, because one of the things I think the arts does in terms of what the students are getting from general art classes is they get resilience, they get problem solving, they get long term thinking. Because that I think ceramics is great for that. Because when you're sitting at the wheel, they're not always thinking about what they're going to glaze it, but by the end of their first course, they probably have made that connection. Like, oh, I could make a pot and know what I want it to look like. Like that skill, I think, is really valuable.
The parents' night is one of my favorite nights of the year. The parents come in and they basically follow their kid's schedule and go to each of the classes. And it's not a time where it's, you're sitting down one-on-one with a teacher. I have the parents in my room and I've got 10 minutes with them. And it's one of the only times of the year where I get to try and explain why this class is important and what the kids will get out of it. And you touched on some of what I talk about that night is that, these kids are going to learn things that are much bigger life lessons. And, you know, it, we were talking about frustration a few minutes ago, and, the idea that learning to control your frustration is a skill. And if I'm not saying that you won't feel that coming on, but how do you recognize that frustration, acknowledge it, and set it aside so that you can focus on what you're trying to do to be the most effective in terms of working at the wheel. And how important is that as a life skill to be able to control your frustration? Like, there's no time when getting frustrated with an employer or getting frustrated in athletics or getting frustrated in a relationship, like that's never going to make a situation better. Talking about critiques and presenting your ideas and sort of defending the ideas that you've come up with, talking about the process and how it evolved through that, and then taking critical feedback from the students in your class and from me. Again, a huge life skill to be able to walk into to a business meeting and say, like, this is the idea that I have, this is the background of it. And yes, that's great feedback. I'll incorporate that into this, as I move forward. And I'll talk for 10 minutes about all those different ideas that are much, much bigger than like teaching a student how to make a bowl or a mug. And the one year a guy stayed after, the 10 minutes ended, and he walked up to me and he said, I just want to tell you that when I looked at my kid's schedule, your class was the one that I was least looking forward to coming to. And he goes, after hearing you talk about what's going to happen with my daughter in here, he goes, I can't tell you how happy I am that she's going to be in your class and that she's going to go through these bigger life lessons and learn them through working with clay. He goes, I couldn't believe the things that I had never thought about. So you and I are on the same page.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to talk a little bit about the curriculum that you developed at Princeton Day School. One of the things that I'm most impressed with is that you get relatively young students to think about 3D printing and 3D modeling with clay. I remember that it was like fourth grade that you get kids in there printing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I teach fourth grade, eighth grade, and then like those students, fourth grade, every single fourth grader takes my class. Eighth graders it's an elective, so they can take any one of the arts or any two arts classes. And then 9 through 12, it's all elective based on, if they want to come in or if they're in performing arts. So I might have a kid for 4.5 years starting in eighth grade, or they may come in, for one class or not at all because they're in performing arts. So back to 3D printing though, I guess this is about 3 years ago that I proposed to get a 3D printer, and it was interesting to me the number of people that questioned why I wanted to bring that technology to the studio. And the most common question that I got was, why would you want to take the hand of the artist out of the work? And there's a really common phrase in education that you meet the student where they are. And there was a student that I had at my last school, and he was a valedictorian of his class, absolutely brilliant, wonderful human being, but he did not have the skill set at the wheel. And he tried as hard as he could. He would come in at lunch, he would stay after school, but the messaging from his brain down to his hands, there was a disconnect. And no matter how I tried to alter my teaching or show him different versions, he really, really struggled with learning how to use the wheel. In the beginning of every single year, I ask all my students to sort of put their head down, close their eyes, and raise their hand if they believe that they're artistic or creative. And I said, the beauty of the question is you get to define what being artistic or creative is. So if that's singing, dancing, drawing, painting, making sculpture, going out in the wood and building things with sticks and mud, like anything that you think is artistic or creative, you can raise your hand. And I asked that question every year, and I would say the average over all the years is probably, half to 2/3 of students don't believe that they're artistic or creative. And so that student, that valedictorian, he was a student that raised his hand in the beginning of the year, and he said, I don't believe that I'm artistic or creative. And then I have them put their hands down and then open their eyes so that they don't have a sense for, how their classmates responded, but I do. And so back to 3D printing, that student finished a year with me, and I think he confirmed his belief that he wasn't artistic or creative. And that was really sad for me. The 3D printer would have met that student where he was, and he would have been able to design something in the 3D realm on the computer, and I would have been able to have our aesthetic discussions with him about the choices that he made and how can you build a relationship from this to this in your design. And then in the end, when he's done with his design and he pushes print, his hands don't betray him. He's able to have the machine make the thing that he designed. And then maybe at the end of that, he would have actually thought, this was something I really enjoyed, and look at what I made. And then he leaves my class maybe having that belief in himself in terms of being artistic or creative. So going back to fourth graders, it was something that a number of years ago, I was having them work with an app on an iPad to do drawing that was called Paper. And then I had my upper school students using an app called Procreate, which is much more advanced. And one day I thought, I'll bet my fourth graders could probably do this. And so I had my fourth graders start using Procreate, and it was so easy for them. Um, and I just felt foolish for thinking that they really needed the more simplified app. And so that's what led me to think that the fourth graders could probably do the 3D design as well. And so they all log into the website, and I teach them how to use the software. And in the end, they all, none of the 3D prints that the kids make look like any of the other ones because there's so many different choices that they can make. So it really is a personal expression, and they all go in different directions, and it works pretty beautifully.
You're hitting on something that I wanted to get your opinion on, which is that one of the teaching modalities is that you start with a lesson plan that's part of a bigger curriculum, and the students fulfill goals but make things that look relatively similar. And I've seen that happen in a lot of public schools that don't have a lot of funding for the arts. It's more just like, this is almost like a curriculum package, and we're going to put it into play, and the student is going to learn X, Y, Z. But then the other way to think about it is that if you can develop a curriculum that has so many different avenues for personal expression that none of the kids' work looks the same, that's a creative environment. Like, you're actually creating a real creative environment based off of your curriculum. So how do you use and develop a curriculum that allows for a really broad expression at these kids at different ages? Because like the fourth, eighth, and high schoolers, like they're at really different points of their own intellectual development.
So fourth grade, they meet me on a trimester schedule, one time per cycle, and that ends up being about seven, sometimes 8 meetings. So it's a really, really short class. They basically get to come down from the lower school into the upper school and come into the ceramic studio or the furniture studio. And so they love leaving their environment, and they feel, coming down to the upper school is a pretty big treat for them. But I would say that in terms of I've only got time to make 2 projects with them, and it goes really, really quickly. And so that speaks a little bit more to what you're talking about, that they have to be, because it happens so fast, it has to be a little bit more like, we're all going to make this plate, we're all going to do this 3D printing design. But then, when you jump up to upper school, I would say, and the way that I talk to students about the classes is that the intro class is much more about being a skill-based class where you're learning how to throw cylinders, and you're learning how to throw bowls, you're learning how to hand mill with slabs, you're learning how to glaze. And then inside of that, there is a tremendous amount of freedom to take projects in different directions, as long as you're sort of building that skill while you're doing it. And I tell them that, the student that comes to me and says, Mr. Rempe, I know that this was the assignment that you gave us, but would it be possible for me to do this? And they're always nervous about asking the question, but every single time I'm super excited because that's exactly the kind of, thinking that I'm hoping that you bring to the project. So, I always tell them, think differently about what you're being asked to do. And that's probably going to be the most exciting. And then you switch to the advanced class where let's say a student took intro as a freshman, they could then go on and take advanced sophomore, junior, and senior year if they wanted to. And then those classes are, instead of being skill-based, are much more concept-based. So, when I sit down at a critique with my advanced students, I feel the projects are most successful when there's no similarity in the work at all. You look around the room and every single kid went in a completely different direction. It definitely makes the job of teaching a bit more challenging because you've got to problem solve in 12 different directions for kids that are trying things that maybe I've never even done before. And so they found something that they saw on Instagram. They're like, I'm going to try this. And so it's just sort of helping all these kids go in different directions. But in the end, it just makes for the work is so much stronger when you give them the freedom to express, more of who they are in the work that they make.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Well, I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about your personal aesthetic and how things have evolved over the years. One of the things that I like the most about your work is that it is so specifically created that the ideas are clear. So let me give you a comparison. I often am trying to put so many different ideas into the same pot that there's like layers and layers and all this stuff. Yours is different. Like you have a singleness of purpose in the way that you throw and the way you touch clay, that it's not that they're minimalist pots, but they're just committed. Like when you touch clay, you are like 100% committed to the mark you're making. So can you talk a little bit about how you developed the confidence in your own mark making to let the pot be the pot? Like let the idea live in the pot and don't complicate it?
Sure.
Even though that was a complicated question.
No, that was I followed every bit of it, and I'm glad that that's how you sort of see the work. I guess I would have to go back to talk a little bit about color blindness first, because that plays a role in all of this. So I see color very, very differently. When I was I knew I was colorblind at a very young age. We were driving on the freeway and my mom said, "Look at all the pumpkins in the field." And I looked over and I said, "What pumpkins?" And she just sort of looked at me like, "What are you talking about? Like all those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pumpkins?" And so distance for me, color really fades and becomes brown. And anytime you blend colors, the blending of colors is really, really confusing to me. So most people can look at a color and they can just answer the question of what a color is. And very often it's problematic for me. Like I have to really look at it, and I just sometimes I describe I use the color blue purple because I can't tell if it's blue or purple, so I just call it blue purple. But I'm very often wrong. And so for me, I took this colorblindness test at Penn State in a design class, and it showed how bad I was in all these different areas. And I was taking a oil painting class, and we all had to go out and paint, a section of the campus. And the professor finally made it around to my station after maybe 2 hours of the class, and he looked at my canvas and looked at what I was painting. He's like, "Why are you painting that color, and why are you painting that color? Like that's not even close." And I'm like, "Well, I'm colorblind." And he looked at me and he's like, "Huh." And he really didn't know what to say. And he's like, "Well, carry on." He couldn't teach me something about color mixing because it just didn't matter. And so that, back to your question, I I've been most attracted to form that doesn't have any color decoration on the surface, because color is just so problematic for me. So if I can keep the forms really, really clean, and then the glaze just really, really, I use this waxy black glaze a lot. And it sort of highlights the form. And so I just try and make the forms as strong as possible and as clean as possible, so that when the glaze goes on, the glaze I want it to just sort of read as one and not as some kind of application on the surface of it. So I've made very, very few things where I did decorative work on the surface. I mean, I'm looking up at my cup wall and I love decoration. A huge amount of my cups here they've just got so much information on the surface, but it's just always been problematic for me. So I chose to focus on form. And then I look at the botanic world a lot. I run our school greenhouse here at Princeton Day School, and I've had a garden my whole life. I've grown orchids for many, many years. I've always been interested in, I just, when I drive around, I look at trees. And so forms from the natural world, I try and bring those into the work that I make. And so I look at these big slipper orchids, and they're just these wonderfully inflated round, curves. And so those I find really inspiring, and they influence this sort of inflated work that I do that's thrown, but then it's distorted heavily afterwards. And bamboo coming up out of the ground with this sort of woven pattern. I've tried, putting that pattern on the surface of the work and then distorting the spaces in between the patterns. Right now I've got brand new work out in the studio that's still wet, that's based on lotus seed pods that I turned into, the seed pod is only, that big, but then I scaled it up into a 2 foot, 3 foot tall vase that are based on those. So, keeping the forms simplified, simple glazing. It's just been what I feel like I try to make honest pots that come from a place that's important to me, as opposed to, I've made a lot of pots in the past where I see something that another artist made and I'm inspired by that. And so I make that work. But then for me, that's always really derivative of someone else's work. And um, it's never really held me very long. I mean, some of the techniques obviously are, combined over the years, but in terms of the inspiration for my work, I want it to come from a place that is honest.
One of the forms you had at last year's Princeton Pottery Festival that I really liked were these vases, altered vases. So the form itself is altered like in a diagonal way, but then you had these, I don't want to call them handles. They're kind of like appendages that kind of grow up into the air. I'm not
Yep.
doing a great job describing it, but can you talk about where that idea came from? Because what it does in terms of serving the flower is it holds the flower up out of the vase, which is really nice. But where did that idea come from?
Just vining plants. So there's a plant that I have out in our atrium outside the studio right now that is from Madagascar. And when it first comes out of it's this sort of um, energy storage uh, where the plant remains dormant. And it'll stay dormant for 5 months. And it just looks like a rock. And then a vine will come out of that as this in its natural climate. When the rains come back, it'll start to grow. And so when the vines come out, they do something called circumnutation, where the vine will come out and it'll just start to go in a circle, and it's looking and looking and looking and searching for something to grab onto and sort of twine around. I've just seen so many different plants that sort of emerge out of the ground, this time of year, especially where things are busting up out of the surface of the mulch and so that, it was a vase that was designed to hold flowers, but, could I make a connection to something again that I'm already looking at that's one more reference to the natural world that I'm inspired by?
That idea of like the circular spinning, looking for something is also like, even though it is a stoneware pot with a black or white glaze, like it feels as if it's growing. I think that's the power of form. Like form can be such a metaphor for the natural world in a really beautiful way. And those pots were it. Like I had that feeling like they were all stretching up off of your shelves, trying to grab the shelf above.
Yeah, and I tell people that I don't, if I have a reference from bamboo, or I have a reference from an orchid, or a reference from a vine, I have zero expectation that somebody would look at that pot that was inspired by bamboo and go, "Oh, wow, that looks like bamboo." I would say most times they're not going to get that reference because they haven't necessarily paid attention or seen that bamboo sheath like right when it comes out of the ground. Most people are familiar with bamboo that's broken up this way vertically, but when it first comes out of the ground, it has this woven look. And so I don't expect people to get the references that I'm using to make my work. But again, they're references of things that are really, really important to me. And I think that's what makes my work different from other work that's out there, is I'm really um, just, like I said, trying to be honest about what's important to me and what I want to put in my work.
We're all getting ready for the Princeton Pottery Festival, which is coming up just in a little bit. And you, myself, and Dallas Wooten are the founders of that. So I thought that we would talk a little bit just about how that all came together. When I first came to you to talk about being a location and also just being a member, that we were going to try to put together a festival for this part of New Jersey, I didn't realize that you had basically done this before. So years ago with the San Diego Potters Tour, you were around either right after that started or when it started. So this is like two things in which you've been a core part of starting. So I have a few questions about that. What do you think organizations need to start a public-facing event?
I mean, I think you have to have people that really want to get it up off the ground. You've got to put the work in. And, when I was in San Diego, I did my first holiday show, and Richard Burkett and Nan Coffin did one, I think a week or two later or earlier, I can't remember. Um, and, I went to their sale, and I think they probably came to mine. And then I just said to them, like, we should do this the same weekend next year. Like it makes sense. Like we're not that far away, and I can give out flyers for your event. You can give out flyers for my event. And so that was like the very, very first thing we did was we just both combined our sales. We still stayed at our own studios, but then we referred people to each other. We referred our people to the other sale. And so then the next year we just decided to take that same idea and just blow it up and invite more people. So, it's a lot of work to organize something like that. And the Princeton Pottery Festival has been the same. I mean, we do, we sit on the same Zooms and go through all the different logistical things that we have to work out. But in the end, that work pays dividends for so many different people, my students included. So, I had a lot of my students come to the festival last year that were, inspired by what professional level artists are doing. And so there's a lot of artists that benefit from it. There's a lot of students that benefit from it. And then there's the entire community that comes and buys pots, and they have those in their lives. And so that's pretty wide ranging. But I think the simplest answer is you've really got to have some core group of people that are willing to put the time in, because it's not something it's not easy to, it's not that it's complex, but it takes time.
Yeah, and when we were talking about it early days, the thing that I really liked is that you had no doubt that we could do it. Like you're like, oh yeah, we can do this. We just got to do this, 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 this. Like you almost had the list in your head instantly.
Yep.
Which is really nice as someone that was working with you on this to feel like, oh yeah, he knows what he's doing.
The other thing that drives me too is I've always wanted to be known in my community. It's so much more important to me to have people coming to buy my pots that can pick up my pots and hold them and talk to me. And I can talk to them about, the influences that I have, and I can show them in my studio, here are the photographs that inspired that mug that you're holding in your hand. And so they get this educational piece, while they're, with me and with my work. I personally get a lot out of those interactions. And I think people leave knowing so much more about the work that they just purchased that makes it that much richer for them.
What do you think the students got? Like, did you see like a boost in energy after last year's festival?
I mean, there's definitely kids that will try new things based on what they saw. And I think the other thing is that more importantly is that they see people doing this on a professional level. And I don't know that, if you're an eighth grade or if you're a freshman or whatever, that you necessarily have ever thought about that before, that like you can go on and you could be a potter. And here are examples of people in our region that are, making a living doing it and doing a really amazing job making pots. And so I think it sort of shows them, another possible path or something that they might be able to add to a degree that they're thinking about, oh, I could also, add a minor, add a double major in fine art as well. So I think seeing that in person and being able to talk to artists and to be able to talk to artists about where their ideas come from, because that's something that I stress a lot with my students about, the work that you make, why are you making that work? And what personal influences that you have that you could bring to the work that you make. And so for them to meet these artists and talk to them about, where their ideas come from, I think is really valuable for them to shape their own thinking.
And in a way, I think my career, your career in Dallas are all kind of proof that high school ceramic education works. Like all of us started in high school, went on to get undergrad and graduate degrees, and now teach and do all these things. So I like to think that there is some eighth grader at Princeton Day School who's going to, in 20 years, is going to be a part of the festival as a potter.
That would be awesome. It's funny because, I taught for 14 years at Coronado High School, and this is my ninth year now at Princeton Day School. And the number of times that I've gotten phone calls and or emails or whatever, and people would say, "Hey, such and such a university is hiring for a ceramics instructor. Like, you should apply." I'm like, "Well, you should come see what I have. Like, you should come to Coronado High School. You should come to Princeton Day School, and you should see where I'm teaching and the students that I'm teaching, the program that I have." Like, I've been so happy at both schools, and I just have no desire to be anywhere than, other than where I am.
One of the things about the way your class is set up is that your personal ceramic collection is kind of the exterior glass wall of the studio. The kids really get to see amazing pots. Like, they see it when the festival people come in, but they also see it all year round. Like, you have some killer Ron Myers pots, Chris Staley pots, Michael Simon. Like, you've got an amazing collection. Do you think teaching with that collection makes an impact?
Oh my gosh, yeah. 100%. The collection that you mentioned out of the windows, that's sort of in their face every time they walk to the studio, they have to walk past it. And if a kid asks me a question about, how do I make a lid? Instead of just answering the question about how do I make a lid or doing a demo, I can actually walk them over to, like you said, a Ron Myers jar and take the lid off and show the flange to the student after I explain it. And they're like, "Oh, that makes complete sense now." And then I show them, uh, how, like you said, Chris Staley, how he did the lid on his teapot, which is different than the Ron Myers lid. And so you can kind of go down and look at different styles that can answer the student's question that are um, done by just amazing, amazing artists. And then I have in my office my cup and mug collection on four really long shelves above my desk. There's probably, I don't know, I've never counted, 150 cups and mugs there. And once or twice a year for every class, I have a hot water kettle and a big thermos for storing hot water in. So I'll tell the kids that they can, we're going to make hot chocolate tea or hot cider, and they get to come into my office and they get to pick any one of the mugs, and then they can make hot chocolate, and we just sit around in a big circle. And when you have to go around, you have to talk about, why did you pick the piece that you made that you chose to drink from today? And so we can have this discussion about design and aesthetics and handles and surface and form that's not sort of abstract. Like, the kids have the piece in front of them that is their favorite of 150 cups. And you have these amazing conversations because of they have access to this. People have asked me, aren't you afraid that, some of this is going to get broken? And for me, there's so much more value in being able to teach from it. And I've lost very, very, very few pieces over the years. And I did this at Coronado also, in terms of the cup collection. I would bring cups in, but I just have a lot more space here to have them on display every single day. And I've only lost one big piece, but it was mine. So I honestly, that was no big deal. It was a big cover jar that got knocked over. And then one former student piece. But, for doing this for decades, I've had almost no breakage, but a tremendous amount of inspiration.
To wrap up, can you plug your website and social media so people will know where to find out more about you?
It's rempepottery.com is the website. And then Rempe Pottery is also for Instagram. I would say that Instagram, I update more, but nowhere near as much as I should. I like making work. I like being in the greenhouse. I don't like sitting in front of the computer screen or on my phone doing Instagram, but I wish I was better about it, but I'm not.
And also, because the Princeton Pottery Festival is at the school you teach, it's almost like you're hosting this at your house. It's just not your house, it's the school. So can you just officially welcome people to the festival?
We've talked a little bit about the festival location, and we could expand it to another location in Princeton Day School, but our studio is really, really wonderful here. I'm very, very lucky to teach here. And, I think it's one of the things that people enjoyed that attended last year was that they could come into this functioning space. They could see student work, they could meet students. And I think right now we've decided that we want to keep this location and not, we're expanding to 12 artists this year. We're adding artist demonstrations in the morning and the afternoon. We're adding a keynote talk on Saturday at 4:15 by Chris Staley. But I think we've sort of settled on this as the location because of this amazing atrium with all this natural light to show off the work. And you have access to the studio, and we'll have access to demonstrations. So, in addition to that, Princeton has a tremendous amount to offer as well. I mean, the new museum opened up, so you literally could make a day of it and come down and see demonstrations, see all the work. In between demos, you could go to the Princeton Museum. So we hope to see you, and 10 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday, May 2nd and 3rd, for a pretty wonderful festival.
Well, I'll see you soon. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks.
I'd like to thank Eric for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to work with him on the Pottery Festival the last couple years. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's Monkey Stuff, the Rosenfield collection of functional ceramic art, and Cornell Studio Supply. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at talesofredclayrambler.com. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.